They were us, just barefoot, firelit, and unburdened by asphalt or screen. The myth of the brutish caveman is one of modernity's laziest stories. A bedtime fable we tell ourselves to feel superior, to justify our fluorescent anxieties and calendar slavery. But the archaeological record says otherwise. The humans of 20,000 years before the Common Era were not aimless scavengers. They were precision tacticians, ecological stewards, social innovators, and artistic engineers of survival. Let's begin with the hunt, because it is here the pagination most often slips into fantasy. The word hunter conjures a lone man with a stone club crouching in the bushes. But real Paleolithic hunting was cooperative, strategic, and technologically sophisticated. At Boxgrove in what is now southern England, humans living around 500,000 years before present, that's 500,000 years ago, left behind more than just hand axes. They left the shoulder blade of a horse with a clean puncture wound, evidence of a direct spear thrust. This was not scavenging. It was targeted hunting, and it required skill, timing, and teamwork. Move forward in time to Schöningen in present-day Germany, roughly 400,000 years ago. Here, archaeologists uncover wooden spears more than 2 m long, carefully shaped, balanced, and weighted like modern javelins. Their craftsmanship implies an understanding of aerodynamics. One spear had a sharpened tip hardened by fire. Others were carved from the base of spruce trees where the grain runs straight and strong. Nearby were the remains of butchered horses. This was not random violence. This was a planned ambush. A group positioned themselves likely near a watering hole and waited. One frightened animal meant momentum. The others followed. The humans struck. These early humans had no metal, no motors, no GPS, but they had memory, observation, and astonishing patience. They understood animal behavior not through textbooks, but through generational watching. They mimicked bird calls. They read hoof prints in mud. They knew wind direction, water availability, herd patterns, and escape routes. In cold regions, they tracked reindeer migrations. In warmer zones, they followed wild boar, elk, and even mammoth. The hunt was not constant. In fact, evidence suggests large game was taken only occasionally, with plant foods making up the reliable daily calories. But when the hunt came, it was a drama of choreography, not chaos. Around 40,000 years before the Common Era, something shifted. Tools became lighter, more specialized. In some regions, the atlet or spear thrower was developed, a carved lever that extended the arm, increasing force and distance. It allowed hunters to launch projectiles with greater velocity from farther away, reducing risk and increasing accuracy. The earliest known atoll fragments date back more than 20,000 years, with widespread use appearing in the Upper Paleolithic. Soon after, in some areas came the bow and arrow, a revolution in range, stealth, and precision. These tools were not intuitive. They required design, testing, iteration. The bow in particular relies on tension, compression, elasticity, and angle, and it had to be taught. You do not invent a bow by accident. You refine it through failure, through mentorship, through memory, which means knowledge was not just personal. It was cultural, and it was shared. Paleolithic life depended on teaching, not hoarding. You taught your sibling to shape the point. You showed your cousin how to bind the sinew. You corrected your child's stance before they hurt themselves. But here's the twist, and it is one modern ears often resist. Despite all the energy required for hunting, gathering, tool making, and moving with the seasons, Paleolithic people likely work less than we do. Anthropologists studying modern foraging societies, such as the Ashkung of southern Africa or the Ache of South America, consistently find that subsistence activities take around 20 to 30 hours per week. That's 4 to 5 hours per day. The rest is spent on rest, rituals, socializing, repairs, and doing what modern economies would call nothing. Of course, survival required effort, but it was not the endless disembodied labor of post-industrial capitalism. It was embodied, seasonal, and communal. Energy out was followed by rest. The world itself provided rhythm. When the sun got hot, you paused. When the rains came, you shifted. When food was abundant, you preserved. When it was scarce, you moved. There were no emails to check at midnight. No side hustles, no artificial urgency. And when the day was done, they had not only survived, they had sung, they had carved, they had danced. The same hands that skinned a gazelle might have painted a reindeer on limestone. The same eyes that tracked movement in tall grass might have noticed the way shadows danced on a cave wall. This was not the world of mindless drudgery. It was a world where work and meaning lived side by side, not in opposition. Let's return to the data. Bone analysis from Paleolithic skeletons shows dense muscle attachments. These people were strong not because they lifted weights, but because their lives required movement. They squatted, lifted, walked, climbed, and carried. But their joints show less evidence of repetitive stress than early farmers, whose days were defined by grinding grain, hoeing soil, and repeating motions. Farmers got more arthritis. Foragers got more fresh air. And what about their brains? Endocranial volume. The internal space of the skull in late Paleolithic humans averages equal to or even slightly larger than that of modern Homo sapiens. This does not mean they were smarter in an IQ test sense, but it does challenge any idea of biological inferiority. In fact, they were neurologically modern, capable of language, music, metaphor, math, and memory. The people of the Upper Paleolithic painted in perspective. They played pentatonic scales on flutes carved from bird bone. They buried their dead with red ochre, ivory beads, and care. Not brutish, not simplistic, just unfamiliar. And yet we continue to simplify them to reduce their complexity to loincloths and clubs. Why? Perhaps because if we took their intelligence seriously, we would have to question our own. If people without ownership, without clocks, without kings or gods could live full, rich, meaningful lives, then what exactly are we doing with all our stuff? If a hunter-gatherer was not a failure on the way to civilization, but a balanced, adaptive, ecologically integrated being, then maybe civilization is not the inevitable arc of progress, but a fork in the path, a choice, a trade. So the next time you picture the Paleolithic hunter, do not imagine a half-dressed brute chasing mammoths with no plan. Picture a strategist, a patient observer, a sculptor of stone, a singer of wind, a collaborator, and someone who knew that survival was not about conquest, but cooperation, not about dominance, but timing. Someone who knew that the real art was not killing, but living together without owning anything. Just enough. They were not simple. They were precise. And their rhythm, their pace, their presence, their patience. It echoes still beneath the noise waiting to be remembered. They did not divide intelligence into subjects. They lived it. Every adult in the Upper Paleolithic was a botanist, a geologist, a tracker, a meteorologist, and a therapist for their kin. Not because it was noble, but because it was necessary. There were no experts. There were only humans whose memory extended not through writing, but through repetition, ritual, and the rhythms of the land. Survival demanded not just strength, but synthesis. You had to know which route burned the tongue and which soothed the fever. You had to feel a change in air pressure and understand it as cloud logic. You had to read tracks in the mud and recognize the limp in a deer's gait, the urgency in its stride, the season in its presence. This was not guesswork. It was applied science lived, breathed, and passed on around the fire. The intelligence of the Paleolithic human is often underestimated because it was generalist. But generalist did not mean vague. It meant integrated. It meant every hand was trained, every sense calibrated. Memory was not stored in libraries. It was stored in scar tissue and soil familiarity. A person who could butcher an aurochs, sew a stitched hide, remember the shape of stars across seasons, and soothe a child's illness with bitter herbs was not less intelligent than a modern specialist. They were more complete. They did not need an app to remind them when berries ripen. They remembered because their life depended on it. And they passed it on, and not with textbooks, but with demonstration, with gesture, with metaphor wrapped in story. The tools they made were not primitive. They were precise. Take the Levoir technique, named for a suburb of Paris where its products were first identified. Emerging during the Middle Paleolithic over 200,000 years before the Common Era, it involved preparing a stone core so that a single flake of a specific shape could be struck off. This required forethought, symmetry, and a deep knowledge of fracture mechanics. This was not trial and error. It was blueprint thinking without blueprints. It was engineering through tactile calculus. You had to imagine a flake before it existed. You had to understand force without measuring it. The tools became more elegant still. In the Upper Paleolithic around 25,000 years ago, humans across Africa, Europe, and Asia began creating microliths, tiny stone blades less than a few centimeters long. These were embedded into wood or bone to create composite tools, spears with serrated edges, arrows with replaceable barbs, knives with specialized functions. This was modular technology. Tools were designed to be repaired, upgraded, adapted. Microliths are the ancestors of Swiss Army knives, of removable blades, of the very idea that function and form could be separated and recombined. This was not savagery. This was design. At Katander in the Democratic Republic of Congo, bone harpoons dating back more than 90,000 years were found in the layers of an ancient lake shore. Their barbs were carved with care, perfectly suited for fishing large freshwater catfish. This was not opportunism. This was specialization based on detailed ecological knowledge. You needed to know the behavior of the fish, the depth of the water, the strength of the current. You needed to know when they bred, when they fed, and when the water would yield. At Sunjir in present-day Russia, around 34,000 years before the Common Era, 2 children were buried with more than 10,000 ivory beads painstakingly carved and sewn into clothing. Alongside them lay spears, ornaments, and symbols of ritual significance. The precision and patience required to carve such beads, each the size of a fingernail, implies thousands of hours of focused labor. These were not people working for mere survival. They worked for beauty, for meaning, for legacy. They abstracted not with symbols on paper, but with their hands. And at Gough's Cave in what is now Somerset, England, human bones were found with marks of both butchery and engraving. Skulls were shaped into cups. Arms and thighs were etched with zigzag patterns. This was not mindless violence. It was ritual practice, perhaps tied to ancestor veneration, grief, or memory. Abstraction lived not just in decoration, but in transformation, in taking human form, and giving it a second meaning after death. This was cognitive complexity made tangible, a story told in bone. All of this from harpoon to bead, from spear point to flute emerged not from a theoretical mind, but from a hand that repeated, refined, remembered. Abstraction begins in material intimacy. It begins when you strike a stone the wrong way and ruin a week's work. Then learn. It begins when you notice that sinew flexes more cleanly if soaked overnight. It begins when you learn that fire changes color when burning particular resins. These were experiments repeated daily across generations. The Paleolithic was a laboratory without walls, a university without books. Every family was a research institution. Every campfire seminar. Music, too, was not absent. It simply did not survive. But here and there hints emerge. In Jen Klussel Cave in Germany, flutters made from vulture bone and mammoth ivory were discovered dating back over 40,000 years. The spacing of the holes aligned with known musical scales, including pentatonic arrangements. These were not random pipes. They were tuned instruments requiring knowledge of pitch, acoustics, and breath control. The maker of such a flute had to understand not just shape, but sound. The listener had to understand not just notes, but meaning. Song requires syntax. Rhythm requires repetition. Memory as melody's ancestor. In every carved line and smooth edge, we see abstraction at work. Not abstraction as philosophy, but abstraction as process, as discipline. Paleolithic humans did not need to invent algebra to think mathematically. They practiced geometry in every thrown spear, every shaped core, every symmetrical ornament. They understood material properties, not in theory, but in tactile memory. The way antler bends before it breaks. The way bone shatters under pressure. The way a blade glides better if flaked in a curve. They also knew the sky. Astronomical markings found on bones, and cave walls suggest lunar tracking. Seasonal awareness and cosmological thinking. The so-called Venus of Lausel holds a horn with 13 notches, possibly representing lunar months. Other sites show tally marks aligned with solstices. These were not calendar makers in the modern sense, but they understood time through cycles, through watching, through living in synchrony with what the heavens mirrored on the earth. Their clocks were the bodies of animals, the shape of the moon, the smell of rain, and they were teachers. Knowledge did not belong to individuals. It belonged to the group. Children learned by doing, by being given small knives, small flint cores, and the time to fail. There was no shame in the first broken scraper, only the quiet approval when the angle finally clicked. Learning was performative, communal, and embodied. The elderly were not obsolete. They were libraries, memory keepers, carriers of song lines, trails, plant cycles, and stories that instructed through metaphor. If you did not remember the story, you did not survive the winter. If you did not teach the story, your people forgot how to fish when the river changed. What this means, and what modern minds often forget, is that generalist knowledge is not shallow. It is deep in a different direction. It moves across disciplines without separating them. It connects stars to seasons, plants to illness, tools to story. It weaves a world where you do not need to own anything because everything you need is stored in your body, your community, and your memory. Paleolithic intelligence was not about abstraction divorced from use. It was about abstraction rooted in touch. And in this sense, perhaps they were wiser than us. For in our era of hyper-specialization, we have forgotten how to be whole. We outsource, we segment, we forget. But they remembered. They remembered how stone breaks, how fire flickers, how fish behave, how grief needs a song. And they carved all of it into the world. So we could remember, too. The caveman is a myth. Not because humans never stepped into caves, but because the figure of the caveman tells us more about our need for superiority than about their reality. The club dragging oaf is a mirror we built to make ourselves look taller. But the real reflection staring back from the Paleolithic record is humbling. They were like us. They laughed. They argued. They raised children. They made art. They grieved their dead. And they innovated ceaselessly, not for profit, but for survival, for community, for continuity. Consider how much of their world was communal. A hunt was not an individual achievement, but a coordinated act of trust. A bead was not just decoration, but a node in a web of symbolic meaning. A fire was not owned by one person, but shared by many. Even memory itself was collective. What you forgot, someone else remembered. What you struggled to master, someone else would demonstrate. This distributed knowledge system made them resilient, adaptive, and far less isolated than the myth of the solitary caveman suggests. Their tools were not just practical objects, but also carriers of teaching. A flake struck at the wrong angle was not waste. It was a lesson. A broken spear was an invitation to redesign. And each generation inherited not static artifacts, but dynamic practices. Tool making was as much pedagogy as it was production. Each stone core, each shard of bone, each polish point was a reminder of hands before yours and a guide for the hands after. And what are their stories? Around fires, they would have woven worlds into words. Myths that explained rivers and seasons, spirits and shadows. These stories were not primitive religion, as colonial anthropology once suggested, but systems of knowledge encoded in metaphor. To say a mountain had a spirit was to say it demanded respect, patience, and caution. To say the moon was a guide was to remember its cycles, its tides, its timings. Their myths were not errors of science. They were forms of science, couched in memory, repeatable, transmissible, binding communities to landscapes. The Paleolithic mind, then, was not a blank slate waiting for agriculture to paint it with culture. It was already painted richly, thickly, with layers of perception and abstraction. To carve a flute is to think in sound. To bury a child with beads is to think in legacy. To etch marks in the bone to follow the moon is to think in time. The so-called dawn of civilization was not the invention of meaning. Meaning was already there, in ochre dust, in antler tips, in the hush of a winter cave. We often think of ourselves as the apex of innovation, yet the Paleolithic record suggests otherwise. They invented modularity before industry, aerodynamics before physics, music before notation, ritual before scripture, and sustainable ecology before the word ecology existed. They lived in tune with the land not because they were saints, but because they had no choice, and perhaps because they recognize more than we do. That choice is always an illusion against the backdrop of seasons. So when you hear caveman, strip away the cartoon. Imagine instead a world alive with firelight on stone walls, hands passing down tools with patience, voices rising in song that no longer survives, eyes looking up at stars not yet named but already known. Picture not ignorance, but intimacy, not brutishness, but balance. A kind of wholeness modernity aches for, but can scarcely imagine. The Paleolithic is not past. It is present, still running in our blood, in the shape of our hands, in the rhythms of our sleep, in the memories our bodies keep. Every squat, every stretch, every hum of a tune, every craving for story around fire is an echo. And if we listen closely, beyond the static of screens and the hum of engines, we might hear it again. The patient pace of people who knew that survival was not accumulation, but attunement. Not conquest, but continuity. Not progress, but presence.